I stared at the pile of letters scattered across my son Danny's old desk, my hands trembling as I held the one that had just shattered my world completely. The return address read Mercy General Hospital, and the date was from 3 years ago. 3 years. My grandson Jake had been in the hospital for a week with pneumonia, and nobody had told me. "We didn't want to worry you, Mom." The letter quoted my daughter-in-law Sarah explaining to Danny, "You know how you get about medical things." How I get. I'm a retired nurse. I spent 40 years taking care of other people's families, and my own son thought I'd be too fragile to handle knowing my own grandson was seriously ill. But this wasn't the first letter that had knocked the wind out of me today. I'd found dozens of them, hidden in Danny's old bedroom dresser while I was cleaning out the house to downsize. Letters spanning 15 years, all containing family secrets that everyone had apparently agreed I was too delicate, too old, or too something to handle. And as I sat there reading through lie after lie, betrayal after betrayal, I realized that the family I thought I knew had been treating me like a stranger in my own life. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was 74 years old, discovering that while I'd been bending over backwards to be the perfect mother and grandmother, my family had been systematically cutting me out of every important moment, every crisis, every decision that mattered. They'd turned me into a carefully managed outsider, fed only the sanitized version of their lives while they shared the real stuff with each other behind my back. I should probably explain how I got here, sitting in my son's childhood bedroom at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, surrounded by evidence of my family's collective deception. It started 3 weeks ago when my doctor recommended I consider moving to a smaller place. At 74, maintaining this big house where I'd raised my 3 children was becoming too much. My arthritis was getting worse, and the stairs were becoming a daily challenge. Danny, my youngest at 45, had been the most supportive about the move. "Mom, it makes perfect sense," he'd said over Sunday dinner. "This place is way too big for you now. Let me help you go through everything and decide what to keep." His wife Sarah had nodded enthusiastically, and even my daughter Lisa had agreed it was time. Only my oldest son Mark had seemed hesitant, but he lived across the country in California, so his opinion carried less weight in the daily discussions. I'd been grateful for Danny's help. After his father died 8 years ago, Danny had really stepped up as the family coordinator. He organized our holiday gatherings, kept track of everyone's birthdays, and always seemed to know what was going on with his siblings and their families. I thought it was wonderful how close-knit our family had become, how well they all communicated with each other. How naive I was. The house clearing project had been going smoothly for the first 2 weeks. We'd tackled the basement, the attic, most of the main floor. Danny had been coming over every evening after work, and Sarah joined us on weekends. They were so helpful, so organized, always suggesting which rooms to focus on next. Looking back now, I realized they were carefully steering me away from certain areas, always finding reasons why we should save Danny's old room for last, or leave Dad's office for another day. But yesterday Sarah had called in sick, and Danny had to work late for some client emergency. I was feeling energetic and decided to make progress on my own. I'd started with Danny's room simply because it was the smallest and I thought it would be an easy win. Most of his stuff had been gone for years anyway, since he'd moved out at 22 to start his engineering career. The room still looked essentially like it had when he was in high school. Same blue walls, same twin bed with the navy comforter, same desk where he'd done homework and later college applications. I'd always been sentimental about keeping the kids' rooms relatively unchanged, just in case they ever wanted to stay over or needed a place during a difficult time. I'd started with the closet, which contained mostly old clothes that could go to charity. Then I'd moved to the desk, expecting to find maybe some old school papers and expired pens. The bottom drawer had stuck a little, which was why I'd never really cleaned it thoroughly before. When I finally jimmied it open with a butter knife, that's when I found them. At first, I'd thought the letters were just old correspondence Danny had kept from his college years. There was a small wooden box pushed toward the back, the kind with a simple hinged lid that you might use for jewelry or keepsakes. But when I opened it, I found it was full of letters, cards, and printed emails, all carefully organized with rubber bands by year. My first instinct had been to close it and leave it alone. These were clearly personal items Danny had chosen to keep, and I respected his privacy. But then I'd noticed that most of the letters were addressed to the house, to our address, not to Danny's apartment or his later homes. And many of them had my name on them too, as if they were meant for both of us, or for the family in general. That's when curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled out the first bundle to take a closer look. The earliest letters were from 2009, right around the time Danny had gotten engaged to Sarah. I remembered that period as being somewhat stressful because Sarah's family had very definite ideas about wedding planning, and I'd felt a bit excluded from some of the preparations. But I'd attributed that to normal mother-in-law dynamics and had tried not to take it personally. The first letter that made me pause was from Sarah's mother, Martha, addressed to Danny. It was dated 2 months before the wedding, and it was clearly responding to something Danny had written to her. The part that caught my attention was in the second paragraph. I completely understand your concerns about your mother's involvement in the ceremony planning. Sarah and I have discussed this, and we think the best approach is to give her small manageable tasks that will make her feel included without actually giving her any real decision-making power. I'd read that sentence 3 times before the meaning really sank in. They'd been strategically managing me. The small manageable tasks I'd been so grateful to be assigned, addressing invitations, organizing the guest book table, coordinating with the florist on the day of timeline, hadn't been given to me because they valued my help. They'd been designed to keep me busy and feeling useful while the real decisions were made without me. But that letter was nothing compared to what I found as I kept reading. There was a letter from Lisa dated 6 months after the wedding, discussing how to handle telling me about Sarah's first miscarriage. I really think we should tell Mom, Lisa had written to Danny. She's been asking why Sarah seems so sad lately, and she keeps offering to help with things, thinking Sarah is just stressed from the new job. But Danny, if we tell her, you know she'll want to do something. She'll want to bring food and check in every day, and probably suggest home remedies and prayer circles. Sarah's barely holding it together as it is. The letter went on to describe how they'd decided to wait until Sarah was emotionally stronger before telling me, and how they'd ask Sarah's sister to provide the day-to-day support instead. I'd never been told about that miscarriage at all. By the time I found this letter, 15 years later, Danny and Sarah had had 3 healthy children, and I'd never known they'd lost their first baby. I'd had to sit down on Danny's old bed at that point, trying to process what I was reading. My daughter-in-law had been grieving the loss of what would have been my first grandchild, and instead of being allowed to support her, I'd been considered too overwhelming, too much to handle during her crisis. The next bundle of letters was from 2011, and these were mostly between my 3 children. Apparently, they'd started using written correspondence for sensitive family discussions specifically because they were worried about me overhearing phone calls or accidentally being included in email chains. Mom's been asking a lot of questions about why Mark canceled his Christmas visit, Lisa had written to Danny. Should we tell her the truth about the divorce, or stick with the work story? Mark's response, written on his law firm letterhead, was diplomatic but clear. I'd prefer to keep the personal details private for now. The work excuse is easier, and frankly, I'm not ready for Mom's advice about marriage and relationships. You know how she gets. There it was again. You know how she gets. Apparently, this was a common phrase in my family's private communications about me. I was someone who got a certain way about things, someone whose natural reactions couldn't be trusted, whose instincts to help and support were seen as problems to be managed. I thought Mark had been incredibly dedicated to his job during that period, working so hard that he couldn't even come home for holidays. I'd been proud of his work ethic, even while missing him terribly. I'd sent care packages to his office and left encouraging voicemails about how I understood that sometimes career had to come first. In reality, he'd been going through a difficult divorce, dealing with custody issues with my granddaughter Emma, and struggling with depression significant enough that Lisa had written about being genuinely worried about Mark's mental state. He'd needed his family's support, and instead of being able to provide it, I'd been given a cover story designed to keep me in the dark. The letters from 2012 revealed another layer of deception. Sarah's second pregnancy had been high risk, requiring bed rest and frequent medical monitoring. There were detailed letters between Sarah and Lisa discussing doctor appointments, test results, and fears about potential complications. Lisa had apparently taken time off work to help with childcare for Jake, who was 2 at the time, and had been Sarah's primary support person throughout the difficult pregnancy. I'd known none of this. During that entire period, I thought Sarah was just having a normal second pregnancy. When I'd offered to help with Jake or bring meals, I'd been told that Sarah's mother was already taking care of everything, and that too many helpers would be overwhelming. When Sarah had seemed tired or stressed during family gatherings, Danny had explained it away as normal pregnancy fatigue. The truth was that Sarah had been on partial bed rest for 4 months, had been hospitalized twice for monitoring, and had delivered Tommy 6 weeks early. I thought he was just a small newborn when I finally met him. I'd never known he'd spent 10 days in the NICU, or that the early delivery had been planned by doctors who were worried about Sarah's blood pressure. My hands were shaking as I read Lisa's letter describing the night Tommy was born. I've never been so scared in my life. When they said they had to do an emergency C-section, I thought we might lose both of them. Thank God Danny was there, but I wish we could call Mom. I know she'd want to be here. But Sarah made me promise not to tell her until everything was stable. She says Mom would just worry, and wouldn't be able to help anyway since she can't drive at night anymore. I couldn't drive at night anymore. That part was true. My night vision had gotten worse as I'd aged, and I'd stopped driving after dark unless it was absolutely necessary. But I would have figured something out. I would have called a taxi, asked a neighbor something. My grandson had been fighting for his life, and I'd been at home watching television completely unaware. The patterns in these letters were becoming painfully clear. Every major family crisis, every important decision, every moment when someone really needed support, I'd been systematically excluded. Not because they didn't love me, the letters made that clear enough. They talked about protecting me, not wanting to worry me, thinking I couldn't handle stress because of my age or my health or my tendency to take on too much. But the effect was the same regardless of their intentions. I'd been living in a carefully constructed version of my family's life, one where everyone was always fine, where problems were minor and temporary, where my children had everything under control and didn't really need me for anything important. The 2013 letters revealed that Mark's financial situation had been much worse than anyone had told me. The divorce had been expensive, and he'd made some poor investment decisions that had left him struggling to pay both child support and his mortgage. There were letters between him and Danny discussing a loan. Danny had apparently lent Mark $15,000 to avoid foreclosure on his house. During that time, I'd been constantly praising Mark for how well he seemed to be handling everything post-divorce, how impressed I was that he'd managed to keep his house and maintain his lifestyle. I'd even commented to friends about how responsible he was, how well he'd planned financially for his future as a single father. The reality was that he'd nearly lost everything, had been working 60-hour weeks just to stay afloat, and had needed to borrow money from his younger brother just to keep his daughter in the same school district. When I'd offered to help with Emma's school expenses or suggested I could contribute to her college fund, I'd been told that Mark had everything handled, and was too proud to accept help from his mother. But he hadn't been too proud to accept help from Danny. The letters made it clear that Danny had been functioning as the family's financial coordinator for years, helping both Mark and Lisa through various difficulties, coordinating loans and gifts and support systems that I'd never been told about. Lisa's letters from 2014 revealed her struggles with infertility, something I'd never known about at all. She'd been trying to get pregnant for 3 years, had gone through multiple rounds of fertility treatments, and had suffered at least 2 more miscarriages that I'd never been told about. Sarah had been her primary emotional support, and Danny had helped with some of the medical expenses. I thought Lisa's marriage to her husband Tom was just naturally progressing slowly toward children. When I'd occasionally asked gentle questions about their family plans, I'd been told they were taking their time and enjoying being married first. I'd respected that and had stopped asking, not wanting to seem pushy. In reality, Lisa had been going through one of the most difficult periods of her life, dealing with hormone treatments that made her emotional and physically uncomfortable, processing grief from multiple pregnancy losses, and struggling with the financial strain of fertility treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. There was one letter from Lisa to Sarah that broke my heart completely. "I see how natural you are with Jake and Tommy, and I know Mom would be so supportive if she knew what we were going through. She was always so good with babies, so confident about pregnancy and motherhood. But I can't bear the thought of her worrying about us, or worse, trying to fix it. You know, she'd research every fertility clinic in the state and probably show up with casseroles in pregnancy magazines and stories about women who conceived naturally at 40. I love her, but I can't handle being anyone's project right now. I wasn't trying to make anyone my project. I was trying to be a good mother, a good grandmother, a good family member. But apparently, the way I showed love through research and practical help and active concern had become something my children felt they needed to protect themselves from. The 2015 letters were about Dad's cancer diagnosis. I almost dropped the bundle when I realized what I was reading. These letters were written during the last 2 years of my husband Robert's life, when I thought we were facing his illness together as a family, united in our determination to help him fight and stay positive. The first letter was from Danny to Mark, dated just after Robert's initial diagnosis. The oncologist was pretty direct with me and Lisa yesterday. Dad's got maybe 2 years, probably less. The treatment might buy him some extra time, but this isn't the kind of cancer you beat. We've decided not to tell Mom the real prognosis yet. She's already talking about fighting this thing and researching alternative treatments. If she knew it was terminal from the start, she'd completely fall apart. I had to read that letter 4 times before I could continue. For 2 years, while I'd been encouraging Robert to stay positive, researching new treatments, talking about our plans for when he got better, my children had known he was dying. They'd known the chemotherapy was just buying time, not providing hope for recovery. Mark's response letter was equally devastating. I think you're making the right call. Mom's always been a fighter, but this would destroy her. Better to let her keep believing the treatments are working. She'll have plenty of time to grieve after he's gone. Lisa's letter added another layer. I've been watching Mom with Dad during his chemo sessions, and she's so hopeful, so determined. She keeps talking about the trips they'll take when he's feeling better, the projects they want to finish around the house. It's heartbreaking, but maybe it's better this way. Maybe hope is what she needs to get through this. They'd managed my husband's final illness the same way they'd managed everything else, by deciding what I could handle and feeding me information accordingly. While I'd been researching clinical trials and alternative treatments, they'd been quietly making end-of-life preparations. While I'd been encouraging Robert to fight, they'd been helping him process the reality that he was dying. The worst part was that Robert had been part of it. There were letters from him to the kids, dictating final instructions and sharing thoughts he wanted them to have after he was gone. He'd known he was dying, had accepted it, and had chosen to protect me from that reality along with everyone else. I'd spent his final months being relentlessly optimistic, probably exhausting him with my determination to beat something that couldn't be beaten. If I'd known the truth, I could have spent that time differently. We could have had different conversations, made different choices about how to use the time we had left. But they'd decided I was too fragile for the truth, even about my own husband's death. The letters from 2016, the year after Robert died, showed how they'd coordinated my grief process too. There were detailed discussions about how much time to give me before suggesting I start social activities again, who should check on me on which days, how to handle holidays and anniversaries. Mom seems to be doing better this week, Lisa had written to Danny. She actually mentioned maybe joining that book club at the community center. Should we encourage that? Or is it too soon? I don't want her to feel like we're pushing her to get over Dad. Danny's response included a schedule. Let's give it another month. Mark thinks she needs more time, and I agree. But Sarah could mention the book club casually next week, just to plant the seed. We don't want her to isolate completely. They've been managing my grief like a project, with timelines and check-ins and coordinated strategies. While I'd been struggling through the worst period of my life, feeling like I was stumbling through each day without direction, my children had been behind the scenes organizing my recovery process. I've been grateful for their attention during that time, touched by how often they called and visited, how thoughtfully they'd handled holiday arrangements and difficult anniversaries. I thought they were being naturally supportive. In reality, they'd been following a carefully planned schedule designed to monitor and guide my emotional recovery. The 2017 letters revealed financial discussions I'd never been part of. Apparently, after Robert died, there had been some complications with his life insurance and retirement accounts. The kids had spent months working with lawyers and financial advisors to sort everything out, dealing with beneficiary issues and tax implications that I'd never heard about. The estate stuff is finally resolved, Danny had written to his siblings. Mom's going to be fine financially. Better than we thought, actually. But I think we should continue managing the investments through my guy rather than having her try to figure it all out herself. She's never been good with financial planning, And at her age, she shouldn't have to learn. I'd never been good with financial planning because Robert had always handled that side of our marriage, and I'd been grateful to let him. But that didn't mean I couldn't learn, or that I didn't deserve to know what was happening with my own financial situation. According to these letters, I was significantly better off financially than I'd realized. Robert's life insurance had been larger than expected, and his retirement accounts had performed well in the years before his death. There were investments I didn't even know existed, accounts that were generating income I'd never been told about. My children had been managing my financial life without my knowledge, making investment decisions on my behalf, coordinating with accountants and financial advisors who reported to them rather than to me. They'd been protecting me from the complexity of my own financial situation, the same way they'd been protecting me from everything else. The 2018 letters were about Mark's drinking problem. This was another complete shock. I'd known that Mark had seemed stressed after his divorce, and I'd noticed he sometimes seemed tired or less focused during family gatherings, but I'd attributed that to the normal challenges of single parenthood and a demanding career. The reality, according to these letters, was that Mark had developed a serious drinking problem that had nearly cost him his job and had already affected his relationship with Emma. There were letters discussing intervention strategies, treatment options, and custody concerns. I found a bottle hidden in his garage when I was there last weekend, Danny had written to Lisa. And Emma mentioned that Daddy sometimes acts funny after dinner. I think we need to do something before this gets worse. Lisa's response outlined a plan. Tom knows someone who runs a good outpatient program downtown. And I've been reading about family interventions. But what do we do about Mom? If she finds out Mark is drinking, she'll want to fix it herself. You know she'll show up at his house with pamphlets and soup and probably try to get his pastor involved. They'd staged an intervention for Mark without including me. They'd researched treatment programs, coordinated family support, and helped him get sober, all while telling me that he was doing much better after his divorce and seemed to be finding his balance as a single dad. Mark had been sober for over a year by the time I found these letters, according to the dates. He'd gone through treatment, attended meetings, rebuilt his relationship with Emma, and gotten his life back on track. It was one of the most significant challenges and victories of his adult life, and I'd known nothing about it. The letters from 2019 and 2020 revealed more of the same patterns. Sarah's mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, and there had been extensive family discussions about care options and living arrangements. Lisa had had a small cancer scare that had required surgery and follow-up treatments. Danny had been passed over for a major promotion at work, and had gone through a period of depression and career uncertainty. All of these significant life events had been carefully managed and coordinated by my children, with my involvement limited to sanitized updates and surface-level information. I'd been told that Martha was slowing down a bit, but was still doing well for her age. I'd been told that Lisa had had a minor procedure, but was recovering beautifully. I'd been told that Danny was exploring some new opportunities at work and was excited about the future. The most recent letters from 2021 and 2022 showed that this pattern had continued right up until Danny moved out of this house and stopped using it as his mail forwarding address. There were discussions about Jake's struggles in school, Tommy's anxiety issues, and decisions about Emma's college applications. There were financial discussions about helping Lisa and Tom with fertility treatments, and plans for supporting Mark if his custody arrangement changed. My family had been living full, complex lives filled with challenges and victories, setbacks and achievements, and I'd been allowed to see only the carefully edited highlights. They'd created a parallel universe where everything was always fine, where problems were minor and temporary, where no one ever really needed help that I could provide. And the most heartbreaking part was that every letter made it clear that they loved me. There wasn't malice in their deception, just a consistent pattern of underestimating my strength and overestimating my fragility. They talked about protecting me, not wanting to worry me, thinking I couldn't handle stress or complexity or bad news. But in trying to protect me from life's difficulties, they protected me from life itself. As I sat there in Danny's old room, surrounded by 15 years of family secrets, I felt like I was mourning the death of relationships I'd thought were real. I believed I was close to my children, that we communicated well, that they trusted me and valued my support. I thought I was an integral part of their lives, someone they turned to during difficulties, someone whose opinions and help mattered. Instead, I'd been the family member who needed to be managed, the one whose reactions couldn't be trusted, whose involvement had to be carefully controlled. I'd been treated like a child, or worse, like a stranger who had to be given carefully scripted information to keep her from causing problems. The afternoon sun was starting to fade through Danny's bedroom window as I finished reading the last bundle of letters. I could hear his car pulling into the driveway right on schedule. He'd been coming by at 5:30 every day to continue our house clearing project. I heard his key in the front door, heard him call out his usual greeting. "Hi, Mom. How was your day? Make any good progress?" I looked down at the letters scattered across the desk and made a decision. I carefully gathered them all back into the wooden box, exactly as I'd found them. Then I closed the drawer and went downstairs to greet my son. "Oh, I said, giving him a hug that felt different now that I understood so much more about our relationship. Just the usual sorting and organizing. Nothing too exciting. He looked relieved, probably assuming I hadn't found anything that would require explanation or discussion. Good. Where should we focus tonight? I was thinking maybe we could tackle Dad's office. Actually, I said, I think we should take a break from the sorting for now. I've been thinking about the move, and I'm not sure I'm ready to downsize after all. Danny looked confused. But Mom, we've already done so much work. And you said yourself that this place is getting too big for you to manage. I know what I said, but I've had some time to think about it more. And I realize there are still things in this house I need to understand better before I make any big changes. Over the next several days, I found myself seeing everything differently. When Danny called to check on me, I heard the careful management in his tone. When Lisa stopped by with groceries I hadn't asked for, I recognized the coordinated care routine. When Sarah made conversation about safe topics like the weather and my garden, I understood that she was following the family protocol for what subjects were appropriate for me. I started testing the boundaries of my managed existence. I asked Lisa direct questions about her work and her marriage, pushed for details beyond the surface-level updates I usually received. I asked Mark specific questions about Emma's college plans and his own career goals. I asked Sarah about her parents' health and her children's school experiences. Every time, I got the same kinds of responses I'd been getting for years: polite, general, reassuring answers that didn't really tell me anything substantial. But now I knew these weren't just normal family conversation habits. They were part of a deliberate strategy to keep me informed but not involved, updated but not engaged. The hardest part was realizing how much I'd contributed to this dynamic myself. I'd been so grateful for any attention, so appreciative of their care and concern, that I'd never pushed back when they deflected my questions or changed subjects when I tried to offer help. I'd accepted their explanations that I was too generous or would worry too much, or had enough to handle already. I trained my family to manage me by being so eager to avoid being seen as a burden that I'd never insisted on being treated as an equal. But I'd also realized something else from reading those letters. For 15 years, my children had been handling significant life challenges largely on their own. They'd supported each other through financial crises, health scares, relationship problems, and career difficulties without being able to rely on their mother's experience or assistance. They'd protected me from their problems, but they'd also protected their problems from me. And in doing so, they'd missed out on decades of support, advice, and practical help from someone who'd been through many of the same challenges, and might actually have useful perspectives to offer. I'd raised 3 children largely on my own while Robert worked long hours building his career. I'd managed household finances, dealt with medical emergencies, navigated school problems and social difficulties, and all the complexities of family life. I'd helped elderly parents through illness and death, supported friends through divorces and job losses and every kind of crisis imaginable. But somehow my children had decided that this experience made me fragile rather than resilient, that my history of helping others meant I couldn't handle problems myself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that their protection of me had been as much about their own comfort as mine. It was easier to manage a mother who didn't ask complicated questions or offer unsolicited advice. It was simpler to coordinate family responses when there was one less opinion to consider, one less person who might want to be actively involved in problem solving. They'd created a version of me that was easier for them to handle, and I'd been so grateful for their attention that I'd cooperated with my own marginalization. But I wasn't ready to spend the rest of my life being a carefully managed observer of my own family. 3 weeks after finding the letters, I invited all 3 of my children and their families over for Sunday dinner. This wasn't unusual. We'd been having regular family gatherings for years, and everyone was used to accepting my invitations. But this time, I had a different purpose than just maintaining our normal family routine. I spent Saturday preparing Robert's favorite pot roast recipe, the one that took all day but filled the house with the smell of home. I made his mother's apple pie from scratch, something I hadn't done since he died because it always made me too emotional. I set the dining room table with our wedding china, the good stuff that I've been saving for special occasions that never seemed special enough. When everyone arrived on Sunday, they fell into our usual patterns. The adults gathered in the kitchen while I finished the meal preparations, and the grandchildren scattered to their favorite spots throughout the house. Danny helped me carry dishes to the dining room, just like always. Lisa set out napkins and filled water glasses, just like always. Mark carved the roast with Robert's old carving set, just like always. But I was done with just like always. When we sat down to eat, instead of asking my usual questions about work and school and safe topics, I looked around the table at my family and said something I'd never said before. I have something I need to tell you all, something that's going to change how we do things from now on. The table got quiet. Even the grandchildren stopped their chatter and looked at me with curiosity. I know about the letters, I said simply. I watched 3 different expressions of confusion cross my children's faces, followed quickly by recognition and something that looked like panic. Mom, Danny started, but I held up my hand. I found the box in your old room, Danny. I've read 15 years' worth of family correspondence. I know about all of it. Sarah went pale. Lisa grabbed Tom's hand under the table. Mark set down his fork and stared at his plate. I know about Jake's hospitalization when he had pneumonia. I know about Tommy's premature birth and his time in the NICU. I know about Mark's divorce and his financial problems and his recovery from alcoholism. I know about Lisa's infertility struggles and her miscarriages and her cancer scare. I know about Sarah's high-risk pregnancies and Martha's Alzheimer's diagnosis. I know about the financial arrangements you've made for me that I've never been told about. I know that your father's cancer was terminal from the beginning, and that all of you knew it while I was still researching miracle cures. The silence at the table was complete now. Even little Emma, who was only 8, seemed to sense that something important was happening. I know that for 15 years you've all been coordinating what to tell me and what not to tell me, how much I can handle and how much would be too much for me. I know that you've been managing my involvement in this family, like I'm a child who needs to be protected from complexity or difficulty or truth. Danny cleared his throat. Mom, we can explain - you can explain later, I said firmly. Right now, I need to tell you how this is going to work from now on. I looked around the table at each of them. These 3 adults I'd raised who had somehow decided I was too fragile for their real lives. I'm 74 years old. I've been married for 47 years, raised 3 children, worked as a nurse for 4 decades, and managed this household and family through every kind of crisis you can imagine. I am not fragile. I am not someone who needs to be protected from life. And I am done being treated like a stranger in my own family. Lisa was crying now, tears falling silently down her cheeks. From now on, when someone in this family has a problem, I want to know about it. When someone is sick, I want to be told. When someone needs help, I want to be asked. When there are decisions to be made that affect the family, I want to be included in the discussion. Mark finally looked up from his plate. Mom, we were trying to protect you. We thought - you thought I couldn't handle it. But Mark, I handled raising you when your father was working 60-hour weeks. I handled Lisa's teenage years when she was so depressed I was afraid she might hurt herself. I handled Danny's accident when he broke his leg in 3 places and needed surgery. I handled your father's death and my own grief and getting on with life afterward. What exactly did you think I couldn't handle? It's not that we thought you couldn't handle it, Sarah said quietly. We just thought. We thought you'd worry too much. We thought you'd try to fix everything. And what would be wrong with that? I asked. What would be wrong with me worrying about my family? What would be wrong with me trying to help when people I love are in trouble? The question hung in the air because none of them had a good answer. You've all been supporting each other through these 15 years. I continued. Danny, you've been the family coordinator. keeping track of everyone's problems and organizing help when people needed it. Lisa, you've been Sarah's primary emotional support through her difficult pregnancies and Martha's illness. Mark, you've accepted financial help from Danny and emotional support from Lisa. You've created this whole network of family care and cooperation, and the only person you've excluded from it is me. I paused to take a sip of water, giving them time to think about what I was saying. I'm not angry about the secrets themselves. I understand that people sometimes need privacy, and I understand that family coordination can be complicated. But I'm deeply hurt by the assumption that I couldn't be trusted with the truth, that my natural reactions to my family's problems were something that needed to be managed rather than welcomed. Tommy, who was 12 now, spoke up from his seat. Grandma, we didn't want you to be sad about our problems. I looked at this grandson I'd nearly lost as a premature baby, this child whose early weeks of life I'd never known were in danger. Tommy, honey, when people you love have problems, being sad is normal. Being worried is normal. Wanting to help is normal. Those aren't bad feelings that need to be prevented. They're how love works. I turned back to the adults at the table. You've all missed out on 15 years of support from someone who loves you and has been through many of the same challenges you've faced. I could have helped Lisa understand infertility from a medical perspective, since I worked in obstetrics for 10 years. I could have helped Mark navigate divorce and single parenthood, since I watched my own mother do it successfully when my father left. I could have helped Danny understand the financial planning I've actually been doing since your father died, since I've spent the last 8 years learning about investments and retirement planning. Danny looked surprised. But Mom, you always said you didn't understand financial stuff. I said I'd never handled it during my marriage, because your father liked managing our money and I was happy to let him. But after he died, I had to learn. I've been working with a financial advisor for years, Danny. I've made investment decisions and retirement planning choices and tax planning strategies. The fact that you never asked me about it doesn't mean I haven't been doing it. I could see them all recalibrating their understanding of my capabilities, trying to reconcile their image of me as someone who needed protection with the reality of what I'd actually been managing on my own. Here's what's going to change, I said. From now on, I want to be included in family decisions, not just informed about them after they've been made. I want to know when people are struggling, not just when they've already figured out solutions. I want to be asked if I can help, not told that help is already arranged. Mom, Lisa said, her voice shaky. What if you really can't handle something? What if there are situations where you genuinely would be better off not knowing? It was a fair question and I've been thinking about it for weeks. Then I'll tell you that myself. If I ever feel like something is too much for me to handle, or if I need to step back from a situation, I'll communicate that clearly. But that's my decision to make, not yours. And if there are ever situations where you genuinely think my involvement would make things worse, then you can tell me that directly, and we can discuss it like adults. I looked around the table at my family. These people I loved more than anything in the world. I don't want to be the family member who needs to be managed. I want to be the family member who can be counted on. I want to be someone you turn to when you need help, not someone you protect from needing to help. The conversation that followed lasted until almost midnight. My children apologized, explained their reasoning, and struggled to understand how their good intentions had created such a painful situation. The grandchildren asked questions about family secrets and trust, and why adults sometimes thought kids couldn't handle the truth. It was the most honest conversation we'd had as a family in decades, maybe ever. Danny cried when he told me about the night Tommy was born, how scared he'd been and how much he'd wanted to call me but hadn't because Sarah was so worried about overwhelming me. Lisa sobbed when she described going through her miscarriages alone, feeling like she couldn't add to my grief after Robert's death by sharing her own losses. Mark was the hardest for me to understand because his alcoholism had been the secret that hurt me most. When I asked him directly why he hadn't felt he could come to me for help, his answer was brutally honest. Mom, you've never had a drink problem. You've never struggled with addiction. I was afraid that if you knew, you'd try to fix it with logic and love and determination, and I knew that wouldn't work. I needed people who understood that this wasn't a problem that could be solved by trying harder or caring more. It was painful to hear, but it also helped me understand something important. My children hadn't been protecting me from their problems because they thought I was weak. They'd been protecting themselves from what they perceived as my particular style of helping, which they experienced as overwhelming rather than supportive. "But Mark," I said, "even if you couldn't accept direct help from me, wouldn't it have been better for me to know what you were going through? Couldn't I have supported you in other ways, even if I wasn't part of your treatment team?" He thought about that for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, it would have been better. I think I was so focused on managing the immediate crisis that I didn't think about what excluding you would cost all of us in the long run." That conversation became the template for rebuilding our family relationships. Over the following months, my children slowly began including me in their real lives rather than the edited versions I'd been seeing for years. I learned that Jake had been struggling with anxiety and social difficulties at school, problems that went far beyond normal teenage awkwardness. I was able to share strategies I'd used with Lisa when she'd gone through similar issues, and I connected Sarah with resources I'd learned about through my work with families dealing with anxiety disorders. I learned that Mark's relationship with Emma had been more complicated than I'd known, that she'd been angry about the divorce and resentful about his drinking for years. But I also learned that his sobriety had allowed them to rebuild their relationship in ways that were stronger than before. When Emma started having trouble deciding between colleges, I was able to share perspectives from my own experience helping young patients and their families navigate major life transitions. I learned that Danny's job situation had been more precarious than anyone had told me, that the promotion he'd been passed over for had been part of a larger pattern of workplace discrimination that had left him questioning his entire career path. I was able to help him research his options and connect him with employment lawyers I'd known through my work at the hospital. Most importantly, I learned that my family's problems weren't too big or too complex for me to handle. They were just life, the normal challenges that every family faces, and I was perfectly capable of being supportive and helpful without being overwhelming or intrusive. The process of rebuilding trust wasn't easy. It took months for my children to break their habit of filtering information before sharing it with me. It took time for me to learn how to offer support without taking over, how to express concern without creating additional pressure. But slowly, gradually, I began to feel like I was part of my family's real life instead of being a carefully managed observer. The most meaningful change came 8 months after our dinner table conversation. Lisa called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice shaky with emotion. "Mom, I need to tell you something. And I need to tell you right away instead of waiting to figure out how to handle it." My heart jumped, bracing for bad news. "I'm pregnant," she said. "It's early, only 6 weeks, and after everything we've been through, I'm terrified something will go wrong. But I wanted you to know now so that if something does happen, you'll be part of it instead of hearing about it later." I cried then, not just because I was happy about the pregnancy, but because she trusted me with her fear and uncertainty instead of waiting to share only good news. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for letting me be part of this from the beginning." That pregnancy had complications, just like Lisa had feared. There were weeks of bed rest, frequent doctor appointments, and scary moments when we weren't sure everything would be okay. But this time I was part of the support team instead of being protected from the stress. I brought meals, helped with household tasks, researched doctors and treatment options, and most importantly, I was there to worry and hope alongside everyone else. When my granddaughter Sophie was born healthy and beautiful after a difficult but successful pregnancy, I was one of the first people to hold her. Not because I'd been given carefully managed visiting hours, but because I'd been part of the journey from the very beginning. The letters I found in Danny's room had revealed 15 years of family secrets, but they'd also revealed something more important. They'd shown me a family that loved each other enough to coordinate care and support through every kind of difficulty. The problem hadn't been that my family didn't work well together. The problem had been that I'd been excluded from the working. Now, at 76, I'm not the family member who needs to be protected from complexity. I'm the family member who helps coordinate responses to complexity. When problems arise, I'm part of the discussions about how to handle them. When decisions need to be made, my experience and perspective are part of the consideration process. I never did downsize from this house. It turns out that having a place large enough for family gatherings, guest bedrooms for when people need somewhere to stay during difficult times, and space for grandchildren to spread out during visits wasn't too much house after all. It was exactly the right amount of house for someone who wanted to be fully involved in her family's life. The wooden box of letters is still in Danny's old desk drawer. Sometimes I look through them, not to reopen old wounds, but to remind myself of how much stronger and more resilient my family is than anyone realized during those 15 years of managed relationships. Those letters documented a family that could handle financial crises, health scares, relationship problems, addiction recovery, and every other challenge life had thrown at them. They showed children who supported each other through difficulties, spouses who worked together during crises, and grandchildren who adapted to changing family circumstances with remarkable resilience. They showed a family that was perfectly capable of including one more member in their support network, if that member insisted on being included, rather than accepting protection from involvement. I learned that the most important thing I could teach my adult children wasn't how to protect me from life's difficulties. It was how to trust that I could handle whatever life brought to our family, just like I'd been handling it for 7 decades. And I learned that the most important thing they could give me wasn't protection from worry and stress. It was the opportunity to be useful, to be needed, and to be trusted with the full truth of their lives. At my age, I don't have time to waste being anyone's carefully managed version of a mother and grandmother. I only have time to be the real thing with all the worry and involvement and active caring that comes with it. The letters had shown me that my family's love for each other was strong enough to survive any crisis. Now I know it's also strong enough to survive complete honesty about what those crises actually look like, and strong enough to include me as a full participant in facing whatever comes next. That's the real strength of family, I've learned. Not protecting each other from difficulty, but trusting each other to handle difficulty together.